We've got two guest speakers, as I mentioned. So there's Inge Brouwer and there's Thierry Attilano. And I would like to invite Inge to start straight away with your presentation.
Great. So I will talk a little bit about what is a food system and what is food system approaches. I'm also basing a lot of what I say on the work we are doing in Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and Vietnam in the framework of a CGR research program, which is called Better Diets and Nutrition now, and also Namukulo is one of the co-directors of this program that started beginning of this year. And actually thinking about food system already started about 20 years ago. It's not a complete new concept. And that was done in response to, dissatisfaction with the supply-oriented development programs that are often using a rather linear food security thinking. But as we discussed shortly right now, production or supply alone cannot improve or are not the only things that are required to improve the preferred outcomes of food system transformation. So soon after, a more holistic framework was developed, which is depicted here based on the high-level panel of experts. That is showing all elements and activities of related to production, processing, distribution, preparation, consumption, and disposal of food, and also the different outcomes of these activities, which are including social, economic, and environmental outcomes. And we like this framework very much because it gives a central place to diets. But we also realize how complex this food system is, and it's highlighted by Namukulo already, because of the complex interactions between actors, between value chains of healthy foods, at multiple levels, from community up to global levels, and also addressing these multiple drivers. And as we mentioned already, it's dynamic because there are feedback loops. If you try to improve one of the components of food systems, it will definitely have a feedback loop. If you look at the different interests of the actors involved, they have different interest, and there are often trade-offs between this interest. And of course, we are also looking at synergies of these different interests. So why is it important? It helps actually to think about or to agree about what we actually want from a food system together. And it helps to recognize a range of different outcomes, but also to see the different trade-offs and synergies of these outcomes and how to navigate between them. It recognizes different activities that are related to each other. And it helps to recognize the food system drivers and the feedbacks. So going to the next slide. There is an urgent call, and that's also, I think, one of the reasons why you link up in this, where you joined this e-course. There's an urgent call for future-proof food systems, and I don't have to repeat all these points because you will hear them over and over again. But to address these challenges, we must understand the underlying processes and also identify the opportunities for systemic change to eradicate hunger, and then foster also inclusive and healthier food systems and protect our planet's health. So working together, understanding the underlying processes, and then proceed with addressing these processes to transform food systems to better outcomes. So it was actually the UN Food System Summit that accelerated attention to food system and the importance of food system transformation. And many countries proceeded with developing national action plans for food system transformation. Of course, they talk a lot about the different outcomes of food system transformation, highlighting indeed the importance to address nutrition and health. But if you go deeper into the strategies that are developed, you see that there's still a lot of emphasis on agriculture and economy. And that's coming from the major worry on how to feed the growing population in 2050. So a lot of innovations are focused on closing yield gap and also reducing food loss and waste, for example, in markets. Nowadays, you do see an increasing attention or combination of this agriculture economy attention with climate change because of the worry to end natural resources. And we are adding now emphasis on reducing environmental footprint and adaptation and mitigation of climate change. But you still see very little evidence to nutrition and health. So I always say that in the first 3-4 pages of documents, you see highlighting the importance of nutrition and health as a political discourse. But if you go deeper into documents, you see very few strategies that are addressing nutrition and health, and even less attention you see to governance or to food system governance, and focusing on the unequal distribution of resources and going into the political economy and the government's strategies that are needed to transform food systems. And I would like to take this opportunity that as a nutritionist, we actually pledge for a reverse thinking. So not starting at production or at supply level to find solutions, but actually to start from the diet. And we are convinced that this will help to start thinking out of the box and to come with out of the box solutions, as it relies on backcasting from desired outcomes to policies and programs that are required to move the system into a right direction. And it provides room for imagination, and it also enables a lot of dialogue and discussion about these issues amongst the stakeholders, amongst you, I assume. So it's not everybody is convinced. We know that. We have discussed some of these common narratives that are heard when we talk about food systems and the use of reverse thinking. Some of them we discussed already. Economic growth and reduced poverty will reduce malnutrition in the long term. We said that, well, economic growth and poverty are not automatically reducing malnutrition. It can even lead to overconsumption and overweight and obesity and diet-related non-communicable diseases. And we have many examples of that in Mexico, in Brazil, and also South Africa. And then closing the yield gap will produce enough food. And this is fueled a few staple crops with the goal to produce more calories and to stimulate the economy, affecting diversity of the nutritious foods that are available and affordable for the consumer. So the question is, yes, closing the yield gap, but will it nourish people? Another common narrative is that cereals provide most of the nutrients, so we need to produce more of them. And indeed, many diets in African and Asian populations are unbalanced in the sense that too many of the calories are derived from these cheap staple foods. And that is leaving too little space for valuable foods or nutritious food that deliver other essential nutrients. And it's important to recognize that staples or other cereal crops are not the best sources of bioavailable iron, zinc, and high quality proteins, for example, and that sometimes small amounts of animal sourced foods are needed to fill the gap of these nutrients and do that more efficiently than having a high nutrient containing cereals. Another common narrative that is said very often is that consumers demand what is best for them. But if you think about yourself as a consumer, do you really demand what is best for you? And I think we have to answer that question with no. And the last point is about the protein transition. whether it will improve sustainability and healthiness of diets. Well, maybe, but it's reducing again, animal sourced foods towards meat and towards protein, and we need much more than only proteins. So it's limiting the justification of having better diets through food system transformation. So we have to be very careful with that to stay holistic. These are some of the narratives, and I'm sure that you have more narratives to share in a discussion. So what it actually means if we want to talk more about after production and markets, we need to talk about the consumers and the drivers of their consumer choice. Here you see a picture of three persons, women in different regions, who have different personal drivers of food choice, depending on religion or routines, their skills, their knowledge, their preferences. And with this, let's say, a backpack full of drivers that they go into their food environment. And their food environment is the place where they meet actually the food system and where they make their choices, what kind of foods they would like to consume. So they go online, they go to their markets while going to school, they will pass shops when they go to their workplace, when they play in their community, and foods are offered in the different retail. So this food environment determine actually to a large part what foods are purchased through marketing and regulation, through food prices, through the availability of food, so the actual presence of food, through the accessibility of food, how close is the food to the persons, to the properties of the vendors, whether they sell on credit, for example, and the product properties, and also through the convenience that they offer. And this is all linked because they get their food from the food supply system. So as an example, the work that we did in Vietnam, for example, we looked at adolescence as a very vulnerable period to develop food habits. And what we saw in this population is that they have a moderate risk for nutrient inadequacy, but the largest concern was that the intake of the healthy foods, so fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, beans, was very low. But their intake of the so-called unhealthy foods or ultra-processed foods was also low. So when we looked at the food environment, actually, we saw that there was a widespread availability of the unhealthy foods. And this was suggesting that keeping the consumption of these foods at their current low level could be very challenging. And in the picture on the right side, you see the distances of the different types of food to adolescents in rural, peri-urban, and urban areas. And you see consistently that the distance to ultra-processed food and sugar-sweetened beverages was much smaller than the distance to fruits, as an example of healthy diet. So you can imagine that in future, the unhealthy foods intake will increase very rapidly. And this is asking for interventions or regulations of the food environment. Now, there are many components of food systems that we have to address. There are many potential innovations, and also in our projects, we do implement different innovations at the consumer level, at the food environment level, addressing through a mass media, television, having labels, etc. But I have to admit that we do not have a lot of evidence that these innovations or these packages of innovations really do have the potential to transform food systems or to influence transformation on food systems. That's still a research that we have to continue to do. For example, we say that food-based dietary guidelines, as we developed in Ethiopia, will finally transform food systems. or will contribute to a transformation of food systems. But we still have to provide the evidence that they are really doing that. And we need a clear theory of change of the innovations or package of innovations that we are doing. But we also need method, tools, and indicators to really analyze the potential effects. So also we have to realize that context matters. So what works in one context does not work in other contexts. And we really experienced that in working in the 3 countries in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Ethiopia. We need to work at policy level. We need to work in coalitions and networking. And we have to try to find different innovations, both technological and social innovations. And all these 3 groups of innovations and solutions should actually implement it together. And we should focus on accelerators of transformation, which is a focus on gender, on diversity, on inclusiveness, but also on financial mechanisms. So we do have sufficient evidence, and I would like also you to discuss during the course on how can you document, monitor, and evaluate the transformation or the transformation processes in your country, and document successes and especially also failures, because we can learn from them, and try to identify signals of transformational change. And what are the early signals? What are the late signals? And what kind of things do you expect in your country to happen when you go towards food transformation for better outcomes? I would like to leave it here. And I'm open, of course, for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Inge. That's a wonderful roundup of a lot of research, and also a lot of your understanding and interpretation of the policy discourse as it has been over the last decades, as you mentioned. Great. Now, I have a first question that was posed by one of the participants. I want to ask Inge about it, and I'm going to read the question. It's from Armando Mazoio from Mozambique. And I really would like Inge to respond to this question, because I think it really speaks of a reality of working in this field, which I think people in many countries may recognize. So Armando is asking, this is a question to Dr. Brouwer. I am Mozambican. The country has a broken food system, with supply being insufficient, although there's lots of potential on agriculture and fisheries. Another big problem is the coordination between various government departments. I'm currently working at GAIN, and we are strengthening food systems by supporting financially and technically food producers, processors, and distributors. My question is, how do we manage or balance the need to provide food for people that don't have access with the right, correct environmental and healthy diet patterns? In the case of regions facing droughts, floods, and cyclones, and also being unstable due to conflicts, as is the case in Mozambique, how could we apply the food system approach? So I think the core of the question, Inge, is in how do we manage or balance the need to provide food for people that don't have access to the correct diet patterns?
Yes, thanks a lot. I think that's a very relevant question, and also a very context-specific question. I would say, I don't know exactly the situation in Mozambique, but I can imagine it based on my experience in other countries. I think GAIN is doing a lot of good work in different components of the food system, but here in Mozambique, it's also very important to understand why certain populations do not have access to specific foods or do not have access to healthy foods. And often this is related to, let's say, political powers in country. So it means that, yes, you have to work on technological innovations, but you also have to work on social innovations and work with what Thierry also presented, with a large network, and ensure that voices will be heard in this network that are not normally heard. And that could be, representatives of these populations who do not have access. Access is a big container concept because it has to do about availability of foods on the markets, whether they have access to really foods that are on the market, which is a market, let's say, failure. It has to do with food prices. It's related to income. So, and I think you should, also link with different organizations in country to work on these different components together. And not divide, working on these components in different regions of the country. So to ensure that every population is addressed in a certain component, but it should be a coordinated effort. And this coordination is really a quite difficult issue, which has to do with governance, which also has to do with choices on who will benefit and who will have to wait for benefits. And I saw also one other question is, okay, how do you ensure that innovations that you are working on are not confirming the existing food system, but are really disrupting the food system to transform to better outcomes? And that's also a question, that I cannot answer yet. We are working in these 3 countries, and probably again is working in Mozambique. And I still don't have a good picture whether we are really, responding to demand of the country, whether that is a way of disrupting food system, or are we actually confirming the existing food system and confirming actually the population that doesn't have access to have no access in future as well. So these are really disruptive, thoughts and that you have to introduce in the country's discussions. And for example, in Bangladesh, we do work with different organizations. They have their own projects and vision and ideas. And one of the major work we are doing is actually bringing them together, having a kind of agreed outcome or future that you have in mind, and then start working backwards to what each organization can do to contribute to that. And it's a very difficult process because you will have, let's say, losers and winners in that process. And losers don't want to lose, and winners want to continue to win. So it's really a political, a political economy process that you cannot, avoid to be part of, or to join in when you do this type of work. It's a long answer, Herman. If I would have a straight answer, then we would have solved the problem. I don't think the food system is broken as such. It's performing, but the question is for who, and not for the population that doesn't have access.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you, Inge, very much.